Okay, hi everybody. My name's Rob, and I run a small design studio in the UK. I started off as a photographer about 20 years ago, and that's an important point because I think for Maxwell, having a knowledge of at least how a camera works, even if it's just the basics of what an f-stop is and everything, is very important. My career's progressed over the years from photography to image editing and then into 3D. But I still do the kind of the whole thing, and they're all relevant to each other. I also write for 3D World and 3D Total and a few other kind of blogs and things as well. You can find me on the screen there, that's my details. But for this talk, I wanted to go through Maxwell Render, why I use it, how to use it, and kind of the general principles from a Cinema 4D user's point of view. So to start with, I'm just going to open up Cinema 4D, and we'll talk about kind of the whys first of all. As Cinema 4D artists, we've got access to a number of renderers. So what's the reason to invest in Maxwell? And use a third-party solution instead of what's built in, because there are a number of renderers built in. Firstly, I think it provides the best results. That's the main thing for it. Secondly, the workflow is very fast, it's intuitive, and it kind of, for me, using software which is almost invisible to my daily work is what's important, and Maxwell doesn't get in the way. You don't have to learn things like kind of GI passes, you don't have to make the decisions like whether you're going to use irradiance caching, brute force, or final gather. All of that stuff's taken out of the equation. Just show you the interface very briefly before I get into showing you some scenes. So Maxwell is a plugin which I've added here as a little toolbar, but it lives as a plugin like any other Cinema 4D plugin, and all you need to do really is to add a scene which gives you this section in the attributes manager. And what you're looking for, the main kind of part of the software, are these four controls here, and that's where the power of everything lives in a kind of a photographic sense. So you can see there you've got kind of f-stops and ISOs and shutter speeds. Now everyone's familiar with how to take a picture, and these controls are what you would find on a camera. And this is really the kind of the basic principle that you need to get hold of if you're interested in using Maxwell. Very, very simple. Now, there are other benefits as well, the material system and controlling light in an understandable way. So rather than having a primitive or a parametric light in your scene, you have a geometrical object which emits light much like any bulb would in the real world. And Maxwell is a simulator, it's not kind of it's an unbiased renderer. It doesn't use cheats and post effects. So Cinema 4D's renderer uses post effects to do things like depth of field, whereas you don't need to worry about that with Maxwell. So speed, this is a big one I think. There's a common misconception that Maxwell's slow, but that's actually just because you're looking at it from the wrong point of view. If you take a single render processing, then it might not be as quick as maybe using the standard Cinema 4D renderer. But firstly, the quality is not going to be there, and also you can end up doing many renders to get to the end result. And I deal with clients on a daily basis who say, can you up the light on that side of the model, or can you change the scene so it's lit from a completely different direction, and you have to go in and you have to re-render and re-render. Even kind of color temperatures and light, not just the intensities, all that kind of stuff, the balance and all those things you have to render and render and render. And as you know, renders take time, but with Maxwell there are ways to kind of circumnavigate that problem. This animation was made from just one single frame rendered out from Maxwell. So this could have been probably an hour and a half maybe to render a high resolution and with all the information. It could have been a quicker render. So all of this light information you're seeing here, this was just one frame exported from Cinema 4D. All of these light changes, they're all done using Maxwell's Multilight system, which I'll show you in a second. But again, I think what's important to take from this is that this one scene was one frame. There was no kind of animation control. I didn't have to go in and change anything in the lighting. I didn't have to change any of those emitter settings at all. And if I open up that scene itself, I'll just show you what that was comprised of. Just as a basic overview of what the scene contains, I'll just drop my camera view. And all I've got is this is a part of an actual, it's kind of a small town, this scene. I've just stripped out everything because I'm under NDA from the client, but there's nothing kind of recognizable in here other than what is effectively a box. There's a glass roof which is made using a pyramid, and if I just open up the room for you here, you can see that we've got the roof is made from an atom array. So it's just a pyramid which has been triangulated, and the atom array makes the frame, and a copy of that frame, the pyramid shape, is the actual glass itself. So if I just hide that, you can see what's inside. And that one. So I have this just empty box with a few materials put on it, and I have this tree here, which is a part of the LabWorks plant kit, which I'll just show you here. We have another plugin. If you ever do anything that's using kind of trees and plants, this is a particularly versatile way of doing it. So you open up the plugin, and you have a selection of trees here. When you add them to the scene, you just double click to add it to the scene. You have one here, and it gives you a few options. So you have kind of options for age of the tree, with variations within there again, and then you can have what time of year you want it to be in, and that will update all of the textures at the same time. And the reason I'm mentioning that now is because the latest version of this plant kit plugin supports Maxwell as well. So all of those materials will copy straight over into the Maxwell render, which didn't happen before. So that's a pretty neat solution. Anyway, so I have a number of objects here which are light emitting. If I just zoom in to one of these lights, we have a set of lights on a rail here, and these are kind of your standard 12-volt LED downlighters that you might see in any kind of domestic kitchen. I have these massive 1200-watt floodlights in the corners, and I have the environment itself. So Maxwell's environment system is pretty simple to use, but pretty powerful. If we go into the environment here, you can see we have options for the sun and a physical sky, which I'm also using within this scene. You can drop down that there, and you can use the sky dome and the HDRIs, or you can have nothing but the sun and objects that you add within the scene itself. So you can turn the sun off, but actually it's a pretty powerful sun. So if I go back to my picture viewer, you can see we have this kind of blue sky in the background, and that's all driven by that environment settings. If I go right back to a point here where it's bright daylight, you can see the sun here. Now, quite often you find with GI solutions and physical suns, you have quite a harsh shadow, which it can look quite realistic, but actually isn't always. And Maxwell has this ability to kind of soften those hard natural shadows by using a radius factor. So whereas quite often you'd use a directional light for a sun, which is just a fixed point, you can actually set a radius factor here so that the sun can have a disk, which I've got set here for 10 in this scene, which gives you what is quite obviously a sunlight coming through, but softens it up in a very realistic way. Now, this render itself, like I was saying, is created using the sky environment, the physical sun, and I've got geometry in the scene emitting lights. Now, this is probably a good time to talk about the lighting and how you can set up your own lights within a scene. So I have floodlights in here, and if I open up the material editor, this is the same as you would add a material to any Cinema 4D object, you just drop it on and it becomes a tag on your geometry. So you can see if I come up here into my room, I should be able to find that light. It's probably in the props. So I've got some floodlights in here, and that material has been added to the lens part itself. And I have a few of those. Now, one thing to kind of keep in mind when you're using these materials is that light emitting materials in Maxwell are kind of spread, the power of them is spread across any geometry that they're applied to. So if I wanted to be able to control my 4 floodlights, which are in each corner of the room individually, I would need to create 4 of these floodlight light emitting materials. And then when I get into Maxwell and I have the Multilight setup working, then I could control them all with various sliders, which is an important thing. So I also have the ability in Maxwell here to use IES lighting. What's quite good when you're setting up these kind of lights within Maxwell is that if you select the top level of your material, you can come down here to where it says scene, and you have a few options. And as you can see, I already had IES there, and this is the setting for your preview. So you may not want to for any reason, but if you were going to use kind of a drapery, then you could do that, and you can see this isn't quite right, and why would it be? I mean, it shouldn't be. But if I was using a light emitting cloth, or if I was doing, say, a net of fairy lights draped over a ball, I could use that setting there, and then the texture that I was using to drive those lights would show up on this as kind of draped cloth. In fact, if I show you, if I just open another material here and set that to cloth or drapery, you'll see what it does. So if I just refresh that, you can see this is kind of a good way of previewing your materials. Now, let's go into... So when you're in here and you go and you're ready, everything's set up, your materials are all in place, your lights are where you think you want them, you can go to your scene here, your Maxwell scene, and you have various options to get everything into Maxwell itself. You can either choose to render out your render view, which is kind of your live camera. If I go back in there, so that would render this scene. If I wasn't looking at there, I can use my active renderer, and that would render whatever I'm actually looking through in my viewport at the time. Or you can just export the scene itself without doing any rendering. You also have Maxwell Fire, which we'll look at in a minute, which is the kind of interactive renderer. So I'm not going to do that now. I've already got that rendered out. And here is the scene I have. So that's kind of the base render. And within this, I have these sliders that you see. They're kind of like audio controls. And these are where you can control the intensities of your lights. And not only the intensities, if I just swap back to Cinema 4D again, if you go to the engine section of the attributes, you have Multilight here, which is, by default, is turned off. But for this render, I turned it to intensity. You can change it to color as well. And if you have it set to color, it includes intensity. And what that does is it will give you a little color picker block at the bottom of all of these sliders, so you can actually change the color of your lighting all during the render or after the render. It's not a post effect, so you end up with a slightly larger file size, and the render will take a little bit longer to calculate because it's storing all of that information in there. But if you watch this preview window at the bottom here, and I decrease the level of those floods or increase them, you can see that that's changing those without having to do any more rendering. I've got that hallway light there. I've got the kind of the little spot downlighters. And the same applies for any environment settings you've got. If you're using HDRIs for lighting your scene or the physical sun and sky, they will both be here as well. And all you need to do is just hit refresh, and that will then update your main render with those new settings. Now, and this is kind of powerful in itself, and you can see how much time this could save you and how intuitive it is, and kind of how you don't end up doing hundreds of thousands of renders over the course of a month, which I was doing before. Now I only have to do one for every scene. I set the angle, and it's all done ready for me there. And in the video I showed you, just that little animation, again, that is incredibly easy to set up. So I could start with all of these lights turned off, or maybe just the sun and the sky turned on. And then if I click on this options here, you can see that I have some animation settings. So I'm just going to turn on auto key. I'll stick with the default frames, but you can change the frame range by just typing in a new figure there. And so auto key is turned on. So at frame 0, I'm going to leave everything as it is here. I'll go forward a second, and I might want to maybe decrease the power of the sun or the sky just a bit to make a kind of more dusky appearance. That's now keyframed. I can move forward again. You can see the yellow keyframe marker. If I move forward another second, I could increase the intensity of that hall light and maybe the downlighters. And that's kind of it. That's all you need to do to animate the lights and change the intensities across your scene. The last step for doing this would be to come into your file and just to save that. Once you hit save sequence, it comes up with a dialog box just to set your settings. Now I exported that as a TIFF sequence, which can then be stitched together in After Effects or whatever editing program you're using. And that really, for me, is what Maxwell is all about. Obviously, there's no camera animation in there, but you can export camera animations as well, just as equally. For me, one of the big things is that I can use a stage object within Cinema 4D. So if I hit Shift-C and just bring up stage, I can add this stage object. And if I have multiple cameras within the scene, I can lay out an edit, and I can do play blasts for a client just using this and the stage object, which basically allows you to just drag a camera into this camera field. And at any point, if I had a second camera, let's just add another camera. So just a standard camera. I've got this second one. I'm going to look through that now, which the stage object's overriding. I want to look through this one at this keyframe. All you can do is just find a new point of view, bring this across to wherever you need it. I'm not really doing anything spectacular here. So I have my second camera, and if I turn my stage object back on, it's automatically swapped to my first camera. If I go to, let's say, frame 30, I could drag in that second camera, which is there, and just keyframe it. And now I have an edit without having to worry about rendering out multiple files. And because Maxwell takes your live camera for your render view, it takes whichever is the live camera, I can press play, and I know that it will cut to the right place. Obviously, I didn't add camera 1 right at the beginning. I should have had a keyframe there. Okay, so now when I press play, that cuts for me, and the edit is done. It's all locked into place, and I don't have to worry. The client's happy with the timing. If there's a sound bed, then the animation will work with the sound bed, and this can now go straight to Maxwell, where all of those same settings I just showed you for the light intensities can all be changed as you need. So yeah, you can change the intensity of the sun the same as you would with any other light. So it's not just geometrical or HDRIs that are, geometrical light emitting objects that are animatable. You can do that with the sun. I believe you can do it with the environment as well. So any of these settings here work the same as any other setting in Cinema 4D. If it's got the grey circle next to it, you can keyframe it. And if you can keyframe it, then obviously you can animate over the course of your scene. So you can even change from the sun type, and you can change your sky type. So if you wanted to make an edit using the stage object, and then you wanted to edit straight into having a different kind of a lighting, so maybe you wanted to have the sun and the sky for your daytime part of the shot, and you wanted to use interior lighting without any of the environment there, rather than trying to change all of those things, you could just switch it off, keyframe it off, and so you could keyframe your sky off just using a keyframe on that type there. HDRIs are perfectly possible using Maxwell as well. So you would swap this to image-based, and then you would load up your background channel, and you can have obviously separate reflection maps using these drop downs. But generally speaking, you would just load in a map here, You can have it visible in the viewport as well, and you would use your scene object. So if we go to a perspective view, you would use the scene, which is located in the center here. You can see this marker here, this yellow bar. That's actually our sun direction and angle. If I just show you what I'm talking about there, go to environment, and if I change this back to using the physical sky, you have show in viewport, which is that yellow marker, and that's kind of located at the scene's axis. Now, for animating the sun itself, you have the latitude and longitude here, or you can choose a location from the list and a time and a day, or you can just click now and it will take it to wherever you are. This is pretty good for if you have a camera report and you're trying to composite into a shot plate. Then using this in conjunction with the camera report is quite useful. Same as using the cameras. Now, cameras in Maxwell are basic, normal Cinema 4D cameras, and they're really only used for focal length and focal distance. Everything else, you don't have to worry about the physical settings in the cinema camera. All you want is to set focal length, and you can use the focus object here, or you can set up a target using Espresso and tags. But generally, you would just drop in a focus object. Now, bear in mind that the focus object is going to focus on the axis point of that geometry. So if you want to have a very shallow depth of field and really kind of narrow that down, then you probably wouldn't want to use this. You would want to use a null. So you would come in and you would just add a null to your scene, and you would go to your camera, drop that null in to that focus point, and you can see there that that's snapped to something different. If I just enlarge that top view, so if I make this my focus target, so I'll just call this focus, I can come in here and now the camera is locked to that focal plane. So if I wanted to line this null up with a character's eye or a particular feature of a product that I wanted to be in focus, then that's how you would do that. And again, this works. You can use this system of focusing with the stage object. You can have multiple focuses and you could swap between them. One thing that is kind of more important when using Maxwell than anything else, I'm just going to open up two scenes. Okay, so I have this one, and then I have this one, and they're both the same scene. If you look at the objects, everything is exactly the same. All of the geometry is exactly the same, and the scene itself is exactly the same. If we come into our engine settings, we can see everything's set the same here. In the output, I have a very shallow depth of field of 1 here, and if I swap over to my other scene, everything is the same. So f-stop 1, but the render results look very, very different. So I have this one, which looks pretty good. You can see that's got a reasonable level of lighting and everything kind of as you would expect it. But if I then open up the other version, which is this one, everything's horribly blown out and looks nasty. And the reason for this is the one thing, I have a lot of students come to me at my studio, and I teach a course as well, which is a Cinema 4D course, which includes a day on Maxwell. And the one thing that I always say is try to kind of create all of your assets and everything, build everything at a real world scale, because Maxwell, being a simulator, wants to treat everything as though it's in the real world. So generally, Cinema 4D artists will make a new scene and they'll add a cube and they'll start from there, and not really thinking that this is a, if you look at the attributes, it's a 2-meter cube. So if they start with this and they're going to build a head, then you're going to have like a 12-meter tall character, which is just not going to work for Maxwell. Cinema 4D's renderer, it'll be fine. You're not going to have any issues. But that is the big problem here. If we do the same and add a cube, you can see this 2-meter cube is, let's just drag that out so you can see it. is completely the wrong size. You want that to be kind of the size of this man. So if this Lego figure was built, so this is like a photographic cyc we've got here, and you can see in this front view, just increase the size there for you, we can see here that we have this 2 meter cube is just a little bit larger than our Lego figure. So our Lego figure is what, 180 centimeters, and that's why this scene, when rendered, looks fine. It looks good. All the lights are working as exactly as you should. But the other scene, if we go to that one, is going to be different. So the only difference between the two is this cube. So this 2 meter cube, as I said, is the size of his head. So that figure is not going to be kind of a real world human size, and that's why the render is completely blown out. And it's because if I take let's just take this spotlight. So Maxwell gives you a really good system for using spotlights, which is an addition in the latest version. If you take just a cube or a sphere, add that to the scene, as basically treat it like your bulb, just so you have somewhere to actually locate your spotlight. You can now choose your emitter part of the material and change the projection to spot. So you normally have Omni, which is kind of just emitting in every direction, the IES, which you saw earlier, and the spotlight. You can choose, and the way of looking at this again is by coming down to our emitter scene. You could choose to use a 2 meter grid or a 10 meter grid. Let's take an Omnilight so I can show that a bit more clearly. So this Omnilight, you can see this is a very, very bright light. It's 1,000 watts. You wouldn't normally have a 1,000 watt bulb in a studio like this, or maybe you would. You can counter this in a couple of different ways, but let's just show you this grid. So at the moment this is just set to stage. If I change this to a 2 meter grid, you can see now that that square in this preview is 2 meters from start to finish. So you can see the intensity and how it falls off, which lets you go into the emitter and change the balance between the wattage and the efficacy. Now, you also have a 10 meter grid for this as well, which is going to be useful for various different scenes. So depending on what you're doing, so you can see the fall off there for 10 meters. Let's just kill that cube. So if you're working to a real world scale, there are a few benefits. Your lighting is going to be much easier, because you know that if you take a 500 watt bulb or a 100 watt bulb, or just a little 50 watt 12 volt downlighter in your house, and you're doing architectural work, you know that what you get is going to be predictable. And I think consistency and predictability are more important for what we do than anything else. It also means that you can reuse assets much more easily. So if you're building a lamp for one scene and you build it at a real world scale, you can store it in an asset library. You can use the content browser and just build yourself whatever you need to use up here. So whatever it might be, build yourself a library. I have a network attached drive in my studio where we have hundreds and hundreds of models, and I know that I can take any one of them, and because they've been modeled with real world scales and they've got real world materials, I know that I can drop them into any scene and they're always going to work, which again saves time. It means that I can bring in a freelancer for a project, or I can take assets somewhere else, and everything's just going to be easier, much easier. Now, let's just go back to our Maxwell scene. So the relationship between the f-stop, the ISO, and the shutter, if you're not particularly into photography, this is kind of where you're going to get the look of your image. So the smaller the number here on the f-stop, the less is going to be in focus. Now, by default, Maxwell has this lock exposure to EV, which is just a way of kind of getting it's a really good way of getting a starting point for your render. If you're finding that your lights are all too bright or not bright enough, then it's worth sometimes unchecking this, changing your ISO. So you can see I've got particularly high ISO for this scene, and the shutter speed is also reasonably fast. But if I kept that checked and I wanted to increase these, then I might find that if the scene scale was wrong, then the f-stop would be, kind of like 0.001 or something tiny, and I wouldn't be able to get what I wanted in focus in the scene. And likewise, if everything in my scene was too small, so I showed you an example where it's all blown out with everything too big. If you model everything too small, then you'll find that actually being able to focus on something that you want and not that the entire world will be almost impossible. You'd have to have kind of tiny f-stops, which in turn would mean you'd need to use incredibly high ISOs, in which case you're then going to run into troubles when you're making your lights. I'll go back in here. This will start off, when you hit the R button to export from Cinema into Maxwell, it will start off quite grainy and noisy, and then you have these sampling levels. So you can see here, I've got a sampling level. This render is finished at 18, which is actually pretty high. Normally this kind of scene would be finished and cleaned up by maybe 10 or 12. And it'll tell you a time until the next one, and then you can kind of say, well, that's good enough, but you might have these tiny fireflies, and they are generally caused by lights being set too high or, in some points, too low. So here I've got an emitter which is, let's have a look. So this is set to 1,000 watts, which is, you know, there are 1,000 watt lights out there, but it's still reasonably high. If I was to go higher than that, you would expect to see some bright spots. So you're better off using the ISO settings and your exposure settings down here to counter those, and they will clear up much quicker if you're not using extremes. The same goes for materials. So if we look at this red material, generally if you're having things that are set kind of at diffuse levels and roughness as well, if this was set to 100, I would find that this red plastic material wouldn't clean up very quickly, and you'd get that kind of added noise. There are ways of dealing with it. If you really want something which has got that kind of roughness to it, then you're probably better off using a map and using some kind of a noise in a map to drive that in the bump channel rather than using the roughness. So try to avoid using, especially with whites, if you're using white materials in Maxwell, don't have anything in the kind of lower 3% of the grayscale and maybe the upper 2 or 3%, because that can cause issues. But again, it's because if you look around you, you don't tend to find things that are 100% white or 100% black. If I go back to the picture viewer, you can see that there are some kind of, in a photography world, there are artifacts. So in this big lamp here, you can see that there are some artifacts coming off the corners and the sides, and there's some diffusion going on, there's a bit of light scattering. Now, photographers sometimes spend some time taking those kind of things out, but actually they kind of add a little bit of warmth and naturalness to an image, which is quite nice, and it adds, if you need it, kind of a slight bit of romance and realism. Now, to add that in Maxwell is actually quite easy. I'll show you how to do it from the Cinema 4D plugin. So if we come into scene here, we can go to the engine, and we can add an aperture map or an obstacle map. So the aperture map is a way of doing that kind of bokeh look that you get with kind of high-end nice lenses, where you can change the shape. It could be a star or, you know, whatever, so that your highlights flare with a given pattern. Now, for that scene, I used an aperture map which was a pentagonal lens. I can show you that Maxwell ships with a few of these. So if I just go into my applications and I choose, where are we? Maxwell, I've got that here. So if I go to Simulens maps, you can see that we have a few here. So I think I used that one as the aperture map, and then you also have obstacle maps so that you can get a bit of kind of light scattering where you might have dust or fingerprints on the lenses. So you have eyelashes. There are actually some fingerprints which I used for that image, and you add them in, and then you can turn on the diffraction and the scattering. Devignetting is a bit different again, but the intensity and frequency tends to work best from a range of about 30 to 60, I've found from my experiences. But again, the more you crank it up, the more you get. I had that scene, I think the diffusion here was set, or the diffraction was set to about 60 for this. And this gave me those lovely highlights you saw in the video.
Well, at the end, it's just a measurement for the amount of noise. It maps to the amount of rays you shot, but not all the rays are valid. So Maxwell uses some statistical techniques for solving the light transport equation called Monte Carlo methods, and it means how much. Well, it's a measurement of how clean your the relationship is a mathematical formula with some logarithms. So this is not just multiplied by 2, but yeah. And in theory, in Monte Carlo renders, to reduce the noise to half, you have to multiply the samples by 4. This is a law that is not entirely intuitive. So typically renderers map that to something a bit more linear, which is what we do with sampling level 2. But as I said, it's not just a linear formula where you say, okay, sampling level 5 means half of the rays of sampling level 10. That's a bit more sophisticated, the formula underneath. Okay.
There's also a system in there so that if you're working on a scene which is overall very, very clean, but you have one area, maybe you've got a material which is causing it to slow down just that section, and you're finding that you have maybe one model in a scene isn't cleaning up as well, you can stop the render everywhere else and concentrate all your processing power on that one extra set so you can clean that up without wasting any computing power. Just using kind of alpha channels. So just give you a quick overview on the actual workflow so you can see it in action. So I'm just going to build just a very quick scene here just so you can see it. So I'm going to build a cube. We'll make this say 4 meters by 4 meters. And this is going to be kind of a photographic site, so kind of like a studio backdrop. And if I make it editable, I'm just going to kill off some polygons here. That one and that one. This is going to be really rough and ready, but it will show you kind of how things work. I'm just going to take my knife tool in loop mode, and I'll add a cut there and a cut there just to tighten things up. And maybe one across here. I can add this to a subdivision surface. So I have this kind of backdrop. I'm going to add a material to this, just create and go to shader. So when you're building a Maxwell material from scratch, you come up to shader and choose Maxwell material. I'm going to drop that onto that site and just double click it to open it up. Now there are 2 ways of editing Maxwell materials. You can use this editor, which is kind of your standard double click editor. You can also, if you're using an MXM, which is a Maxwell material file, from a location on your hard drive, you can put that in here, or you can load it using the standard create and load, and that will be linked to that location on your hard drive, which will open up the MXED, which is Maxwell's own editor, which is a little bit more like the Maxwell Studio interface. Now, creating a material, there's a few ways of doing it. You can either start with this default, which is kind of a standard diffuse material. You can come up to create, and there are a number of wizards. So I'll just talk very quickly about these. So AGS is the architectural glass solution. So if you're doing things like an architectural visualization and you have windows that you need to have reflections on, but you don't have to worry about kind of caustics and all those things that slow a render down, then you would choose AGS, and that will give you a nice transparent material which doesn't take long to render at all. It's very, very quick, but you do get reflections. So that if you're having a nighttime scene inside a room, you would use that, and then you would see the room in the window reflections. Opaque is as you would expect. It's just an opaque material. Transparent is kind of I think that's a dielectric material. Translucent is for kind of subsurface scattering materials. And then you have metals, which gives you a number of options here. So you can pick from kind of some standard ones here, or you can build your own. The car paint is what you would expect. It's a car paint material. And then you've got some standard diffuse emitter where you would build the lights that you saw in the previous scene. The dielectric for glass, which does do things like caustics and refractions, metals and plastics. So let's just build, for this scene, let's build a metal material. So I'm just going to use actually a titanium. I'll change this preview into, actually it doesn't really matter, I'll just use the default preview. So this is where we see what we've got. And you can layer up materials in Maxwell very easily. I could double click on here and I could add some displacement. I could double click on the metal and I could convert that to a custom, which will then take those settings and make them into a standard diffuse material, which you can layer. And when you have layers in a material, you can control them by alpha map, so just normal grayscale maps, and you have an option up here for weighting as well, so you could just have a simple kind of 0 to 100% weighting. Now, what's also quite exciting, especially for people that are new to Maxwell, is the MXM options. So you can go, I mean, I'm not going to have any internet access here, but if you click on the Browse MXM Gallery, it will open up a little interface which is linked to a website on NextLimit's website. And there are about 3,500 to 4,000 ready-made materials that are, they're kind of user-made and NextLimit made. They're really good starting points. There's some ROA textures on there which are great, they're really good quality. And if you really want to kind of work quickly, that's a good way to start. So I've got this material here. I'm going to create another one. I'm just going to go for a normal opaque material. So this opaque material, I'm going to increase the roughness and I'm going to decrease the shininess. This is going to be kind of my paper backdrop. Now you can see here there's an option for clear coat. Maxwell gives you clear coat options. You can have coatings, which we would normally change. Let's just convert this to a custom. So now you can see I have layers. I could choose this main here, and I could add another diffuse texture. I could add an emitter, which can also be layered. So that could be driven by an HDR or an EXR or something like that. I could choose to take my base and add a coating to it. So we've already got a coating because it was made using one of the wizards, but that would be this glossy coat. So you can change the color of the varnish or the lacquer or whatever it is you're working on using these two settings. So reflectance 0 and reflectance 90, they're kind of, this is kind of head on to your view, and reflectance 90 is your glancing angle. So it's kind of like a real world Fresnel. And so if I wanted to have a colored top coat on here, I could do that there, and you can see there's just a slight hint of that red coming through. Hopefully you can see that on there. Now, I don't want that for this. This is going to be my backdrop, so I'm just going to make that a grey. So if I take that material, drop it onto my backdrop, and I'm going to add a sphere to the scene. Just a very simple, I'll make this, I don't know, maybe 60 centimeters across, and I'll just drop that down onto my floor. You can see my loop cut didn't work very well there, but it shouldn't affect the scene. So I can drop that down, and then I'm going to just double click one of my materials, doesn't matter which one, and I'm going to create a new one. So I'm just going to go for a standard metal, and I can choose, again, this is a slightly different method of accessing these settings. I'm going to choose a copper. I could add textures here, so if I had engravings, maybe I could add some bump using a texture to drive that. I'm just going to hit OK for now. You can see we've got the colors. I'm going to apply this metal material to my sphere, and now I'm just going to add a very quick camera. So let's just go up to here and camera. I'm just going to look through it, and then if I just frame up this sphere, obviously this isn't going to be an exciting visual, but it will show you the workflow very easily. I can take that camera and I can drop my sphere as the target object. I'm not worried about depth of field here, so you can not worry about the kind of the axis point which I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to add Maxwell to the scene. If I just click on the plugin, which I've loaded up here, it's just a little toolbar. You've probably noticed there's some other options here. So there are built-in options for adding fibers, so grass and hair, And there's an ocean which is built in as well. So the Maxwell Sea, which I believe probably comes from, does it come from the RealFlow? One of the oceans built into RealFlow, because Maxwell is also available in RealFlow, and including Maxwell Fire, which I'm going to turn on now. So Maxwell Fire is the interactive renderer, and I just enlarge that for you. And you can set how much of your computer's processing power is available to it here. So you can see I've got a sampling level of 7. Quality 3 is quite low, but it gives us a pretty good preview for here. And CPU threads, I could up that to, I think this MacBook, I think it's probably got 8, but I can give it 6. We'll just help it clean up just a bit quicker. I'm just going to add a cube to the scene just so we can see kind of changes a bit more clearly. And let's reduce the size of that. I'll drop that down onto the floor as well. Okay. So I'm going to drop that down, and this is purely so you can just kind of see what I'm doing, because the sphere doesn't show very clearly what's happening. Just look back through my camera again, and you should see now what's going on here is that it hasn't Maxwell Fire will take your lighting and camera information and it will update it live, but if you start adding new materials or geometry into the scene, then you just need to hit the refresh button, and now you can see that that's been refreshed. But if I move the camera around, it will do that no matter what's in the scene. So even if you've added new geometry like you just saw there, the Maxwell Fire will update in real time. So I'm just going to go to Create, and I'm going to go for another Maxwell material. Usually at this point, if I'm doing kind of look development, then I will use the MXM options here, and I'll go to the gallery and I'll type in concrete or whatever it might be, and it will give me a list generally of kind of 10 to 15, 20 more versions of that material, which is a good base point. I'm just going to give this a color, doesn't really matter what. And you can see that's changed, hasn't changed what I wanted, and that's why we're saying Maxwell materials will screw up the fire occasionally. Just reload it and everything's in the right place. And this is no lighting. We didn't add any lighting to the scene at all. So you can go to environment, you can see that the physical sky and sun is turned on by default, and you don't need to do anything to get what is actually a reasonably pretty result for what is a default render. So we could choose now and everything, and it will change the sun. I just click that now. It's kind of guessing where we are based on the location here. Obviously I don't have an internet connection, so it's not really done anything location-wise. But you can see the disk. If I change the radius factor here to something high and change this, you won't see much change in the reflection of the disk, because the disk is more about how the lighting is kind of pushed through the scene than an actual disk in your sky, because that's already there. So that's been an overview of how to kind of get started and some of the possibilities of using Maxwell. If anyone's got any questions for me or Juan here, then stick a hand up and ask for a mic. Is there a mic out there somewhere? Yeah. That's if there are any questions. Anything you'd like to add? Anything obvious that I missed?
No. Sorry. Well, when you saw the Multilight demo, you were using just maybe a previous version of Maxwell, or maybe just the GPU of your machine. But if you open the 3 scene
in Maxwell, this one,
you don't need to use this small preview window anymore, but you can work in full screen. Depending on
that's a good point.
GPU.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you go to Maxwell, to File Preferences or Maxwell Preferences, and depending on your GPU, Fast Multilight Preview is the 4th option. Okay. Let's see if your GPU accepts it. Okay. No, not default. Yep. Sorry.
No. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Just. Okay. Okay. Try to refresh the sliders now. Yeah, that's nicer. Yeah, that's probably the main thing you pretty miss.
Right.
You don't need the preview option anymore in Maxwell 3 if your GPU is powerful enough. Depends on the amount of lights and and the resolution. If Maxwell detects that you're running out of memory, that your GPU doesn't, all the steam cannot fit inside, then it uses a small preview window. Otherwise, it goes in full screen, which is a pretty cool thing. Okay.
I'm guessing most people are going to be fine, because if I can do it on this couple-of-year-old MacBook Pro, then I imagine most computers will be able to handle that.
Okay. Well, apart from any question you have for him, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Juan. I'm one of the developers of Maxwell. If you have questions about Maxwell in general, maybe we are running out of time now, but just feel free to talk to any of us later. Yep. But if you have questions now about Maxwell in general, whatever, feel free. Okay.